My boss fired me to replace me with his friend. He said, "It's just business." I reported him to the board for harassment, and got him fired instead. So here's the deal. I've worked at Axiom Logistics for nearly a decade. Started as the new kid in an entry-level role and climbed my way up, sweat and stress, all the way to a management position. I wasn't some VP or anything, but I ran my department well, and it showed in our numbers. I was proud of the work, felt solid in my spot, and figured I'd be at Axiom for the long haul. Then my boss, Mark, came in. I'd been around longer than him, so I knew every inch of this place and could navigate the office politics without much trouble. Until, of course, he decided his buddy Todd would be a perfect fit to shake things up. Now, I'd known about Todd in passing. He and Mark went way back, college friends or something. Todd would show up occasionally, acting like he owned the place, loud and cocky, joking around with Mark and telling the rest of us about all his big ideas and contacts. Todd was the kind of guy who wore suits a little too nice for what was really just a logistics office, and he'd linger, making weird suggestions as if he were already in charge. It was annoying, but I shrugged it off. I figured it was Mark's way of networking. But looking back, it was more like he was just waiting for a time to slot Todd right into my role. At first, Mark's attitude shifted gradually, almost like he was testing the waters. One day, out of nowhere, he pulls me aside to talk about department performance. Now, I knew the numbers, I'd overseen enough successful projects and brought in enough accounts to justify my entire team's workload. But he hit me with vague criticism. "We just need to do more," he said. I asked him what that meant specifically, but he just muttered something about expecting more initiative and left it at that. Odd, but I figured he was just trying to motivate me. But it didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, he was all over me for every tiny thing. He'd call me after hours, expecting me to solve urgent issues that had suddenly appeared. He'd nitpick my reports, wanting changes for no reason, and everything started to feel like I was somehow doing something wrong. Every Monday morning, he was there in my office, clipboard in hand, taking notes on my performance, making remarks that made it clear he was unhappy with me. And yet, every time I tried to pin him down on specifics, he just sidestepped, saying things like, "We're looking to take this team in a new direction." Then one afternoon, while I was in the middle of a project, he waltzes into my office unannounced, followed by Todd. Mark sat across from me, leaned back, and gave me this long, pitying look. I knew right then that something was up. "Jack, we need to have a serious conversation about the future of your role," he said, all calm and collected like he was about to lay down some groundbreaking wisdom. I raised an eyebrow. "All right. What's going on?" He sighed dramatically, like it was hurting him to say this. "We've decided to go in a different direction. The department needs a fresh approach, someone who really understands how the industry's changing." I sat there, stunned, waiting for him to make some point. But he just looked at Todd, who had this smug little smirk on his face, and it hit me like a punch. They were pushing me out to bring Todd in. "Wait," I said slowly, "are you firing me? To replace me with Todd?" Mark, looking as casual as ever, said, "It's nothing personal, Jack. It's just business. Todd has a unique skill set, and we really think he'll bring something fresh to the team." I was furious but tried to keep my face neutral. "So after nearly 10 years of working my ass off here, you're bringing in your friend because he's got fresh ideas? Come on, Jack," he said with this ridiculous little shrug, "you have to understand it's what's best for the company." I was seething. 10 years of loyalty, and this was how he treated me? I gathered my things and walked out, my mind reeling. But as I was leaving, one thought kept echoing in my head: "You don't get to toss me aside like this without consequences, Mark." That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept replaying the whole conversation, my anger building as I thought about all the nonsense Mark had pulled over the years. He wasn't some office angel. He was a bully, plain and simple, and I'd heard enough whispers from other employees to know I wasn't alone in that experience. I'd seen him berate employees, taking credit for their work, manipulating projects to make himself look good. But one thing that stood out, and that I hadn't forgotten, was his habit of crossing the line with women in the office. There was one woman in particular, Sarah, who'd once hinted to me about how Mark made her uncomfortable. He'd ask her out for drinks even after she'd said no, call her at odd hours to check on her progress, and get too close during office parties. It was clear he didn't understand, or didn't care about, boundaries. I knew Sarah well enough to think she might have more to say if I reached out, so I gave her a call, and it was like a dam broke. She unloaded story after story about his creepy behavior, the way he'd follow her around, make inappropriate comments, and subtly threaten her career if she didn't comply. Then came the bombshell: she'd saved texts from him. Texts where he'd suggested late-night work sessions at his place, where he'd commented on her appearance, where he'd implied she should loosen up to fit in better with the team. Sarah was afraid to report him, but now that I was out of the company and more than ready to expose him, she agreed to send me screenshots of everything. But I didn't stop there. I knew other employees who had been run out of the company in one way or another, either by Mark's bullying or by his constant pushing and micromanaging. One by one, I reached out, and one by one, they shared their stories, building up a picture of a man who thought he could get away with anything. Some had dealt with his harassment, others had seen him manipulate deals and falsify reports to make himself look better. I started to compile everything, creating a full picture of his behavior at Axiom. When I had it all together, screenshots, emails, testimonials, everything, I wrote up a detailed report. I sent it directly to the board of directors with a simple cover letter. I was wrongfully terminated by Mark, who has repeatedly demonstrated unethical and harassing behavior toward multiple employees. Please review the attached evidence. And then, I waited. The response came faster than I'd expected. Less than 2 weeks after I'd sent the report, I got an email from a board member named Alice. She informed me that the board had launched a full investigation into Mark's conduct. They were reviewing every complaint, every testimony, every shred of evidence I'd submitted, and even talking to current employees to verify everything. Alice thanked me for bringing these serious issues to our attention, and I could tell that the board wasn't taking this lightly. The fallout was incredible to watch. Word spread fast that the board was conducting interviews, and from what I heard, Mark was getting increasingly paranoid, calling meetings to rally the team and insisting that everyone stand together against false claims. But the more he tried to deny everything, the more people came forward to corroborate what I'd put in the report. The stories piled up, the evidence mounted, and his behavior had finally caught up with him. While all this was happening, Todd was trying to play manager, but from what I heard, he was utterly clueless. Todd had no idea what he was doing, and it was clear the board saw that as another mark against Mark's judgment. The board was getting daily complaints about mismanagement, about projects going sideways, about clients getting frustrated with the sudden lack of direction. And then, one day, I got a call from Sarah, almost breathless with excitement. She told me that Mark had been summoned to a meeting with the board and that they were going over every allegation with him, piece by piece. He was desperately trying to defend himself, but there was just too much evidence. He'd been cornered, and from the looks of it, his just business line wasn't going to save him this time. The day after I spoke with Sarah, I got another call, this time from Alice on the board. She said they were grateful for the information I'd provided and that they were moving forward with disciplinary action. She didn't give all the details, but it was enough to know Mark was in serious trouble. They were holding an official hearing with him that week, and it didn't sound like they were going to go easy on him. A few days later, I heard from one of my former coworkers who was still at Axiom. Apparently, Mark had been called into a closed-door meeting with the board, and this wasn't just a friendly sit-down. It was an all-out interrogation. They had laid everything out in front of him, the complaints, the emails, the texts, and every piece of evidence I'd put together. Mark, true to form, tried to deny it all, blaming everything on disgruntled employees and even trying to shift the blame back onto Sarah and others who'd spoken up. But his excuses didn't hold up. The board had too much proof, and by that point, they'd interviewed so many people that it was clear Mark was the problem. When they asked him about firing me to bring in Todd, he actually tried to defend that, too. He said that Todd was better suited for the company's direction and called my work stale. But as it turned out, Todd's unique skill set was barely getting him through the basics. I'd heard complaints piling up about Todd's complete lack of competence. He'd mismanaged client accounts, botched major projects, and even messed up some of the logistics that should have been second nature by now. The board wasn't impressed. Then came the real kicker. As Mark sat there trying to wriggle his way out of everything, one of the board members, Alice herself, pulled out a printout of Sarah's messages, the texts that he'd sent her late at night, asking her to meet outside of work, commenting on her looks, and implying that being a team player would help her career. Mark's face went white. He tried to dismiss them as jokes, but there was no laughing off the way he'd crossed the line, and the board saw right through him. They made it clear that this behavior violated company policy and opened Axiom up to serious legal risks. By the end of that meeting, Mark's fate was sealed. He was terminated, effective immediately, for gross misconduct, harassment, and abuse of power. They didn't just fire him, they blacklisted him from any future positions within the industry. They didn't want any association with his name, and I heard they'd even contacted a couple of headhunters to make sure he didn't get easy access to any other executive roles. His career was done. As for Todd, he didn't last much longer. With Mark gone, the board had no reason to keep him around, and they weren't impressed with his fresh ideas that were basically running the department into the ground. He was out within a month, and from what I heard, he wasn't thrilled. Without Mark there to protect him, he had no standing at Axiom. And then came the cherry on top. A few weeks after Mark was fired, I received an email from Alice. She thanked me for my courage in coming forward and asked if I'd consider coming back to Axiom in a consulting role to help repair the department. Apparently, they'd realized just how valuable my work had been and knew the department needed someone who could actually manage it. I thought about it, and while part of me wanted to walk away from Axiom forever, there was another part of me that liked the idea of stepping back in, knowing I'd taken down the very people who'd tried to destroy my career. So I accepted the consulting offer, with a higher pay rate, no less. Walking back into Axiom with my head held high felt like the ultimate revenge. People who'd heard about what happened came by to shake my hand and thank me. I didn't have to deal with the daily grind anymore, either. I was there on my terms, helping rebuild the team, doing the work I knew I was good at, and, honestly, enjoying every minute of it. Mark? Last I heard, he'd been blackballed in the industry. Word of his behavior spread, and no one wanted to take a risk on someone with that kind of record. Pod disappeared off the radar, too, and good riddance. In the end, justice was served. They tried to play me, to toss me aside like I was nothing. But I fought back, and they didn't just lose, I won.